Hello everyone, we are all gathered wherever you are in the world today to talk about sustainability in the automotive supply chain. So for some of us it's a new topic, so I will get into details with all our panelists. First I will introduce them. We have with us Dr. Irene Feige, who is Head of Circular Economy Strategy at DOW Group. Thank you for joining. We have also Dr. Astrid Warrenberg, who is appointed, and appointed is the important word, to connect in Israel, and is going to move to Israel for Volkswagen Group Innovation in a few days from now. And we have Tim Boven from DOW, who is Director of Mobility Science and Global Growth Platform. I'm the moderator, Anne Baer. I'm a sustainability expert since the 90s, so last century. I'm sitting in Tel Aviv, part of EcoMotion, and I'm CEO of iCare Innovation. So as an introduction to the panel, before moving to our three co-panelists, I would like to remind what sustainability is actually. We are talking about three main pillars: the ecological, the green dimension, the human/social community dimension, which deals, for instance, with human resources, and also the economic one. So when it comes to the supply chain, obviously it is impacted by the three dimensions. Today, we are going to focus mainly on the ecological/economic dimension. Road transportation, we are talking about mobility and automotive. How many carbon emissions does it represent all in all? In world CO2 emissions, it represents 15%. So when countries need to commit themselves in different intergovernmental instances, when they adjust their targets, they are actually expecting from the companies to make the effort in order to achieve what the countries or Europe, the continent, committed to. So all the companies that you represent have at some point or another committed to something. And we are going to discuss also the ways, and not only the announcements and the PR around, but how do you figure out to achieve, thanks to technology, amongst others, and to innovation, these targets. For instance, let's take Volvo, who said that by 2040, Volvo per se, I mean the company for its production processes, will be zero carbon or carbon neutral. Same for Ford or Volkswagen in 2050. It's a vision. It's not yet a strategy. At BMW, you adopted a 10-year climate plan. Now, when it comes to the car itself, it's an additional dimension. Being carbon neutral in the production is something, but when we talk about supply chain, we are also looking at the final product, the way it was produced, and also on his whole life cycle, what are the emissions and the environmental impact it's going to have. Volvo said that there will be fully electric in terms of cars offered to the market by 2030, which is quite impressive. Volkswagen ID.3 said that this model will be carbon neutral at birth for his whole life. And the ecological impact of a car is not limited to its usage and to the fuel it consumes, but the way it is designed and the way it is manufactured, the life cycle, and so on. So to cut short, and I think, Irene, you will help me to complete this presentation, I would like to introduce you and to give us a chance to hear you about sustainability. You are the head of BMW Group Institute for Mobility Research as well, not only head of circular economy strategy, and you have 20 years of experience in sustainable transport and also in corporate strategy, which makes it very interesting. In your current position, you aim at reducing the overall ecological footprint of BMW Group. This is your job to do it. And you are setting goals that are binding the group to reduce what we call primary material input, the material that is injected into the car, and to improve the end of life at the other extreme and the value of the car. I mean, end of life value of the car, sorry. Before joining the sustainability community at BMW, you were holding positions in corporate strategy and external stakeholder management. And sustainability is the matter of the whole stakeholder community. So my first question to you is, can you give us the basics of the concept circular economy?
Circular economy actually helps you achieving your CO2 targets. So the more secondary material you put into your car, the lower your CO2 footprint is going to be. Let me explain this a little bit more in detail. So for example, you need aluminium for different parts of your car. When you put aluminium in your car that is comes from primary material that has not been in use before, the footprint of this material is about 5 to 3 times higher than when you take secondary aluminium. So at the same time, when using materials that have already been in a life cycle, and that's why we call it circular, because you go in a circle, right? It has already been used by someone and you reuse it, you have a much lower CO2 footprint. And at the same time, you reduce primary material input. So the whole footprint gets lower because it's not, everyone's talking about CO2, right? The only focus we have in sustainability or mainly is CO2. But it's not only about CO2, it's also about looking into how resources are taken out of the ground, what kind of processes do you have when you process these resources, and also at the end of the life of the car, what happens to the car. And there are a lot of different ways in what the materials in the car can be treated afterwards. And what we want to achieve is to have a closed loop, how we call it. So we want to use materials at the highest stage possible. So for example, when you look at steel, we use a lot of steel in a car, of course, but also a lot of steel is used in other usages, like for example, in construction. But that's a very low grade of steel because this steel can be contaminated, it doesn't matter. So in construction, you can basically use any kind of steel. So what you want to achieve is that you can reuse the steel at the same value level. So to reuse steel within automobile would be the closing the loop, right, within our industry. And that's what we want to achieve, because if everyone downcycles, so gets a lower grade, then a lot of material is wasted. And so what we want to achieve with going circular is that we separate the materials as good as possible and then reuse them for their specific purpose.
Thank you. I think Tim Bowen will have also some insights on recycling and secondary life of materials. Before we turn to Tim, I'd like just to make clarification about carbon. As we know, greenhouse gases, it's not only carbon, there are other gases that are more toxic and more polluting. It's just a sort of currency like the dollar or an indicator that we need to use in order to be able to compare and to assess the impacts in between themselves, or to benchmark ourselves from one carbon assessment to another. So that's why we all talk about carbon, but obviously pollution is or environmental impact is much more than carbon, as you said, Irene. So Tim, good to have you with us. You are, as I said, Director of Mobility Science and of Global Growth Platform at DOW. Maybe I will ask you also to introduce us to DOW, which we know less than the car manufacturers. You hold an MBA and a BS, Bachelor of Science in Engineering. You joined DOW long ago in '87. You worked first on emulsion polymers research, which gives you an idea of what Tim is doing also now. You were developing products for the automotive sector on behalf of DOW, including engineering thermoplastic, polyurethane systems, epoxy systems, brake fluids, lubricants, and structure adhesives. And in August 2018, you joined the recycling initiative, and you became the commercial director responsible for developing new business models and growth strategies that monetize and recycle. My first question to you is, DOW is a chemical company, so the challenge for you of becoming cleaner and more sustainable is huge. What is DOW doing in the automotive and transportation sector, and how this activity has evolved over the years, especially from the sustainability perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Anne. Thanks first and foremost for being here. It's great to be on this panel and talk about this very important topic. So first and foremost, DOW is a global material science company. We supply silicones, polyurethane systems, polyolefin plastics, acrylics, and specialty chemicals to the automotive industry that are used throughout the vehicle. They're used on interior trim, exterior body panels, all the way through to the powertrain and the electric vehicle powertrains, such as thermally conductive adhesives, EMI shielding materials, potent materials for the battery cells, et cetera, et cetera. So we have an extensive array of products that are used in the automotive industry today. DOW actually has a very long history of supporting the automotive industry going back over 100 years. And even back in the 20s and 30s, we started to really engage in sustainability. And when you look at one of our first big lightweighting exercises, DOW was a magnesium producer and worked on very early magnesium engine blocks for the automotive industries, 80, 90 years ago. And we've been doing that type of work ever since. The use of polymers, the use of synthetic materials has only increased every decade in the automotive industry because of their unique properties, namely around lightweighting, around increasing safety, increasing comfort of the vehicles. And so when you talk about sustainability and what does it mean for DOW and other material science companies for that matter, sustainability for us is embedded into every element of our strategy. And this goes from the way we produce our materials. So there's a tremendous amount of activity taking place inside of DOW, looking at how do we make low carbon materials? How do we reduce our own energy footprint? How do we reduce our own carbon emissions? In fact, last year, DOW set our own ambitious targets of being carbon neutral in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2050. You talk about how do we drive circular economies. We've set goals around bringing back recycled plastic into our product mix to enable the use of secondary materials. All the way through development of products now that are designed specifically to enhance and enable the sustainability targets of our customers. How do we bring products forward that can enable lightweighting, that can enable electrification of the vehicle, that can support our customers in achieving their sustainability goals?
Great, thank you, team, for this introduction. Dr. Astrid Warrenberg, we are with you now. And you will be with us soon. As I said, you are moving on June 1st. I hope you will get the second injection and you will be fully vaccinated and come to lead the Connect entity, which is a team that we all know at EcoMotion, for Volkswagen Group. You have a degree in material science and engineering and a PhD in mechanical properties of reinforced aluminum alloys. You have been working in the Volkswagen Group for more than 25 years in various roles and positions. As you see, none of us is coming to sustainability in one bright day. I mean, it's a whole process into your group. And you've been holding different positions like manager for quality assurance in 2 of Volkswagen factories in Germany. You were also head of research in metallic materials and manufacturing processes in the group. Innovation, and your responsibilities include now research work, POCs obviously, and scouting for innovative materials and new manufacturing processes, but I believe that in Israel it will be even broader. So my first question to you is whether you can tell us about Volkswagen Group targets in terms of sustainable production patterns, but also in terms of offering sustainable cars to the market. And if you can even give figures and tell us out of 100 cars who come out of the factories around the world, how many are today electric or / hybrid, and how many are diesel or internal combustion, if you know, and if you can tell us more specifically about the trend.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, let me start maybe with the numbers. I don't have numbers for 2021, but for 2020. In 2020, the Volkswagen Group sold round about 420,000 electrical cars. That means BEV and PHEV cars, out of 9.3 million cars total sale in the group. These are around about 4.5%. Maybe, of course, it's not such a huge number, but it is a number. And what we see is a growth over the years, or over the year-to-year grow from round about 190% in this segment. And for all the products and the mobility solutions, the Volkswagen Group aims to minimize the environmental impacts along the entire life cycle. That means from raw material on one side until the end of life, till the end of life of the whole product. Of course, in order to keep the ecosystem intact and to create a positive impact in the whole society. And compliance with the environmental regulations, with the standards and the commitments, that is the basis of our actions. And we have a plan. It is called Go to Zero. And the plan focuses on 4 action fields, or more 4 main points, I want to say. The first is the climate change. The Volkswagen Group is committed to the 2-degree goal of Paris. And we intend to become a CO2 neutral company by 2050, I think, and you mentioned it before.
Yeah, I'll just explain the 2 degrees commitment of Paris. So we have something called the COP, the Conference of Parties, and Paris, it was in 2015. Yes, in December 2015, Paris hosted the last of the conferences where countries had to give their commitments for the next years. And then every year you have an additional conference where you give your progress report. So the 2 degrees are the difference in the temperature in the climate, in world climate. It used to be in the 90s, the target to remain in this area of having a world average temperature, which is less than a 2-degree increase in terms of averages. So
right.
Actually, it's very confusing because every company is setting targets that it's difficult to compare in between them. I'm looking at actions, and actually I used you, Irene, in order to make an introduction. And I would like to give you a chance also to talk about your company and your targets, since your fellow panelists did it too, and then we will move on to the rest of the panel.
Thank you. I skipped the commercials, actually. I'm not so much into commercials. Everyone is doing big sustainability commercials at the moment. And what's interesting about these commercials is most of them start by 2040 or 2050. Very few people of those who are claiming these things will be in power by then, so they will not be responsible for any claims they have made now. So what we believe in is to have targets that are reachable within the timeframes that we are taking decisions, right? So when I prepare decision papers, they range at the longest until 2030, and that's the timeframes that these companies are deciding on. 2030 is really far off, right? Maybe even 2035 when it comes to certain architectural decisions. But what we are deciding right now goes into the cars in 5-6 years from now, and it will be in the market another 10 to 15 years. So we have these very long time frames. But still, it's very hard to guess what's going to be, what kind of market are we going to have by 2040? How much secondary materials can we actually get? So a lot of these claims are kind of written into the wind, right? And the only thing that we can do is be as specific as possible right now.
So
and
let's
have
be specific. Let's be specific. When we talk about electric cars as the Graal, I mean, everyone is supposed to move to electric cars and then he paid his dime to the environment. What are your thoughts about electric cars? Is it as safe, as clean as in every country? Does it depend on the electricity mix of every country?
So what we can say for sure is that a BEV is better than an ICE, so a battery electric car is better than an ICE car in our markets that we are looking at. So even if you are looking into markets that have a strong coal-based power, like China, for example, even there we have an advantage for an electric vehicle over an internal combustion engine, even in 2020. And the further you go out, because all the countries are shifting their energy mix towards green energy. And so the further you go out in the time frame, the better the electric vehicle will become as opposed to an ICE. And that's why we are moving strongly into electrifying the fleet as fast as possible, ramping up the electrification process. But while we are ramping up the electrification process, we are also shifting emissions from the use phase to the supply chain because the battery is really energy intensive. So we need to make sure that this battery is based on green energy, and everything that is put into this battery is based on green energy or even hydrogen. So that the emissions that you have in the supply chain can be limited. And further brought down. So the first thing you do is you exchange the engine. So you go from ICE to electric. And the second thing you do is you clean up your supply chain. You exchange gray energy with green energy. You exchange gray heat with green heat. And then you go circular, which means you're using secondary materials wherever possible.
Thank you, Irene, for this elements of information. I'll turn to Astrid and team about the trends in auto tech and in new materials. What are the trends today and the innovations that are making the car more recyclable, or on the contrary, the trends that we see that are challenging, that are very challenging to us? In terms of, Tim, you are on mute. In terms of connectivity, for instance, all this data in the car, it's a challenge. So you can talk about materials, but you can talk also about data, connectivity, digital.
Yeah, no, there's several emerging trends, and just to build a little bit on what Irene was alluding to and talking about in her opening comments, a large second trend coming is the use of secondary, but not only secondary materials, but bio-based materials. And how can we secure carbon from alternative carbon sources beyond just fossil fuels? And that's a real challenge. There's a big opportunity, but there's a real challenge in getting alternative feedstocks aligned to production of plastics and petrochemicals that don't compete for land, don't compete for food, don't stress the water systems. And so there's a lot of development and work taking place to look at where can we find carbon sources that are byproducts from the forestry industry, as an example. These products are going to waste today. How can we take those carbon sources, convert that into a feedstock that we then can turn into fundamental monomer and translate that into polymers used in the automotive industry? We see a big trend in there. The recovery of plastics is becoming a much larger focus for the end-of-life directives around the world. Much of the historical recovery of a vehicle had been focused around metal recovery. Metal by weight is the largest component of a car, but we see increased emphasis on recovery of the thermoplastic material. And this is creating opportunities, but yet creating challenges at the same time. I say that because there's lots of different polymers used in the car. And today, generically, those polymers are mixed together, they're ground up, and then trying to find a useful life, restoring that back to the properties that are required to use inside of a vehicle has been a challenge. And so you see a lot of work around advanced recycling techniques, sometimes generically called chemical recycling and others, as a means to be able to restore these materials back to their virgin performance so that they can be used in frontal impact zones and safety areas of the car. So these are emerging trends that we see on the material side.
Thank you. Astrid, since we have only a few minutes left, maybe you have some examples from the Israeli innovation to give us that contributed to these challenges?
Yes, I think I have one or two. Our Hub Connect is working on projects with, of course, several Israeli sustainability startups. Each of the projects, involves several of our car brands. That means like Audi or Volkswagen itself, or Seat or Porsche, and as well our factories. And we expect that these projects are to scale more in the next months. One example is the company called UBQ Materials. UBQ Materials has developed a conversion technology that transforms household waste into green thermoplastic material. It is an additive for a thermoplastic material. It is patented, it is a bio-based material, and it can substitute oil-based plastics. A second example is the company Ecotech. Ecotech is a recycling specialist for rubbers, and Ecotech has its own plant that uses a combination of mechanical shredding and granulation machines, as well as a so-called semi-cryonic pulverization system. And the system doesn't use liquid nitrogen, and at the end you have a very fine milled powder, and it is the whole rubber is separated from other impurities.
Right, so it's already in production.
Yes, it is, right. Mm-hmm.
So maybe we have time for a short conclusion, maybe 1 minute conclusion for each. Team Irene, do you want to start? Irene, team.
Sure, I can start, no problem. Just some final comments from my point of view. I think these conferences, getting the value chain together is critically important, because these are large challenges that we face as a society that won't be solved by any one company alone. And so when you get companies across the value chain working together, addressing the real problems, we can make real progress. And that's what it's going to take, quite frankly, to drive a more sustainable value chain for the transportation industry.
Oh, thanks, Tim. I completely want to blow in that same horn. I think we can only do that together. So we're working closely with suppliers, with the whole supply chain, and we need to tackle these challenges globally, right? So we are all our products are manufactured globally. So when we are reducing CO2 footprint and also primary material input, we need to work on these issues in a global way. We need to have collaborations on these topics, but we also need regulation that supports all of these topics. One of the regulation that we need is a significant and reliable ramp up of the CO2 price in all the markets that we're talking about, because this will help us decarbonize the supply chain and not get punished for being the first, right? Because this is what's going to happen in a commercial way. If we are going to be first and then the CO2 price is really low in most of these markets, it's going to punish those who are really far ahead. So we need regulation and laws in all of these markets that are that will help us plan far in advance. And the CO2 price is one of these signals that we need from regulation.
The last point I want to add is what we discussed at the beginning, that we have to have the focus on the whole supply chain. We as an OEM have to handle not only with the first tier supplier, that means not only discuss all the very important CO2 points with him, that means we have to talk to the entire supply chain, to every very small, very little startup that interacts with us.
Thank you very much. I've learned something in this panel, and maybe it will be my own conclusion. that you are all calling for more simplicity. And when we are talking, for instance, about the electric engine, it is made of only 20 moving parts as compared to hundreds or even thousands in the combustion engine. So more electricity. Irene, you said electric car now. Let's not wait for the mix to be perfect. And more cohesion and coordination in the supply chain, which is actually a 360-degree value chain from cradle to cradle. So thank you very much for these insights. And I hope the Israeli innovation will even contribute more to your challenges in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.